For a person who's so resistant to sports metaphors, Jeff is a surprisingly keen squash player, as I discovered when I arrived in Oxford 12 years ago. Jeff, one of the ways in which Jeff was kind to me, and there'll be lots of stories of Jeff's kindness over the next couple of days, was that he took me under his wing as a squash player, and he encouraged me for about, 6 years before I realized that no matter how many broken knees he had, no matter how many things he had to strap himself into before we started, he was going to beat me. So I gave up and went back to not playing squash. At the time I arrived, Tom Simpson, who's here, also arrived. And naturally, 2 squash players is better than 1, Jeff thought, so he took us both under his wing. And it was interesting to see that he brought his ingenuity that we see so much in his philosophical work. He also brought it to the squash in his social life, realizing that he needed to refer to the other persons while playing the one of us. He elected to call us Tom 1 and 2, respectively. But he had the bright idea that it would be taken amiss by Tom 2, he's in here somewhere, to be known to be Tom 2. So he always referred to the other one as Tom 2. And to this day, neither of us knows who really is Tom 1. I like to think it's
Tom, this was it was meant to be very flattering. If you grew up as I did with Dr. Seuss, it was much better to call you Tom 1 and Tom 2 than Thing 1 and Thing 2.
So we've been promoted. There's a moral status lesson in there for us. Anyway, another person who brings lots of ingenuity and creativity to philosophy is Melinda Roberts, and I'm delighted to say she's here to speak to us now.
I'm so honored to be here, so pleased to be here with all of you. I will keep my preliminaries very brief. I will just say that my interactions with Jeff have not been on the squash court. They haven't been talking to him about sports or being driven around the New Jersey Turnpike by him, having him yell at other drivers, nothing like that. Mostly my interactions with Jeff have been the following sort. I'll say something, Jeff listens carefully. He says a little something, but he looks worried. And sometimes he looks a little sad. And then I go back to my study, I go back to my desk, and I kind of tear everything up, and I start all over again. The only exception, and I mean, he talks a little bit to me, but mostly it's the expression of concern and the sadness that really hit home. It's not the words as much as all of that emotion. The only exception to that form of interactions, which I've had with him maybe a dozen times over the last few years, is there was one occasion when I was talking about the non-identity problem, and I couldn't quite let it go. And I think then he looked at me, not with sadness, but he just said, "That's enough of that, Melinda." That's enough. Okay, so I'm not talking about the non-identity problem today. So let me start. I am talking about one of Jeff's recent papers. He takes up the project of explaining or justifying his own deeply held intuition regarding human extinction. In this paper, I'm going to take a look at the explanation that he provides in that paper. Now, as a preliminary, Jeff notes that some theorists consider human extinction good and the alternate outcome, human survival, to be a bad thing. This position we can call antinatalism. If we put that position in comparative terms, it says that the outcome or possible world or future in which humans go extinct is morally better than the outcome in which humans survive for a very long time, perhaps indefinitely. Translating that in deontic terms, we might say that other things equal, the choice of human survival, according to the antinatalist, is morally wrong. And the antinatalist thinks that even if the additional people would have been well off, would have been happy, and even if their coming into existence would not have made things worse for any other existing or future person, human or non-human, at all. So consider a very local example, my third child example. The example of the non-actual child I could have produced, but never, in fact, did produce. Suppose that child would have been well off. Suppose even that its well-being would have been maximized, and that third child's existence would not have made things worse for me or for any other existing or future person at all. The antinatalist would still say that my bringing that child into existence would have been a bad thing to do. In comparative terms, my bringing that child into existence would have made things morally worse and would have been wrong. So to that position, both to Jeff's ears and to mine, and what I'm going to be doing here is emphasizing where I find common ground between Jeff and me, and then isolate one point where our positions are diverging. So that position, antinatalism, both to Jeff's ears and to my own, seems highly implausible. Under the conditions described, could my having produced that third child really have made things worse? Could it have been wrong for me to have produced that third child? I don't think it should. I don't think it could be. So Jeff moves on in this recent paper of his to note that most theorists, in contrast, and he says himself included, consider human extinction bad. But not just bad, but the worst of all practically possible events or outcomes. So for purposes of this talk, I'm going to call Jeff's intuition, this deeply held, really carefully, internally adjudicated intuition that he has, that pronatalist intuition of his, the extinction intuition. That is the extinction intuition. So I'll just note up front a concern the extinction intuition raises for me, and I think, based on how this particular paper concludes, it's a concern for Jeff too. If human extinction is bad, indeed the very worst, then it seems that human extinction would also be bad and make things worse, not just in cases where other things are equal, but also in many cases where things aren't equal. In cases where human survival does make things worse, perhaps much worse for some or many otherwise existing or future people. Depending on the details of our case, that can be a highly troubling result. Yet the extension of the extinction intuition seems hard to avoid once we accept the intuition in its original form. But I'm putting that concern aside for purposes of this paper. What I want to note is that Jeff's sociological remarks about how many people are antinatalist, how many people are pronatalist, they're limited to those two views. He doesn't really speculate as to how many of us favor a third position, that other things equal, human extinction makes things neither better nor worse. Or generally, that other things equal, bringing the additional happy child into existence makes things neither better nor worse. That human extinction versus human survival isn't on its own, on this view, the important thing. The important thing is that we do the best we can for each person who does or will exist. The important thing is that we not leave any person up the creek at any world where that person does or will exist. That third position is just not a credible position. It's not, the position of this sort of neutrality is not credible unless we add certain restrictions. So I'm going to call this third position restricted neutrality. And it's set forth in the handout. It's up there on the screen. It's the third camp. The restriction on restricted neutrality, it can actually be relaxed in various ways. But you have to have some restriction in place, as John Broom's argument against Narvison's classic unrestricted neutrality intuition clearly shows. The well-thought-out restriction is going to recognize that bringing additional people into existence creates moral risk, that it can make things worse contra the mere addition principle, and it can be wrong, even when those additional people would be perfectly happy and their existence makes things worse for no one at all. So applied to the more local case, we get this result. Restrictions satisfied, the world where I don't produce the third child is no better or worse. I would say it's exactly as good as. The other things equal world where I do produce the third child. Putting the point in deontic terms and more generally, moral agents are morally, though no longer, I will point out, legally or constitutionally in the United States, free to produce the additional child or not. As a type of maximizing consequentialist, I believe that moral law remains non-neutral on many things. Non-neutral on whether I look to the left or to the right now. But I'm pretty sure morality remains neutral on this one thing. So I want to know that Jeff, to his credit, his goal is never to install in each of us, AI style, the extinction intuition, his own personal intuition that extinction is the worst of all practically possible outcomes. I think neither Jeff nor I aim to install intuitions in other people's minds or hearts, however deeply held or internally adjudicated we might consider those intuitions to be. Rather, what Jeff is wanting to do in this particular paper is to explain or justify or provide a theory for, a cogent and testable theory of his own personal extinction intuition. Accordingly, in this paper today, I asked two questions. What is that explanation? What's the theory? And does it work? Does it explain or justify the intuition that human extinction is bad, indeed, among all the practically possible outcomes, the worst? So to figure out what that explanation is going to look like, the sort of basic contours of that explanation, Jeff turns to a case from Jonathan Glover, the infertility pill case. So in that case, the entire existing population has the option of taking a pill that will maximize well-being for everyone in that population. The catch is that every one of those individuals will then be left infertile, so we're facing a last generation scenario. What the Glover case helps us see, Jeff thinks, is that if we think that taking the infertility pill is a bad thing, makes things worse, even as it makes things better for every existing person, it must be that we think that in virtue of what it does to the people who will never exist at all under that choice, to the merely possible. That must mean, according to Jeff, that the good explanation, the correct theory of the extinction intuition will, his phrase is, will refer to the people who could have had good lives, but instead have no lives at all. The explanation, the theory, will specifically say about those people, he goes on in a little bit more detail, that they matter morally, not merely impersonally, not insofar as they are assigned, not insofar as the well-being they're assigned at a given world where they do happen to exist contributes to aggregate well-being at that world, but also, quote, for their own sakes. As to that first point, I am in complete agreement with Jeff. Unlike Jeff, I don't happen to be trying to explain the intuition that the entire existing populations taking the infertility pill makes things worse, though I suspect on other grounds that it does. And I'm not trying to explain the extinction intuition. Still, as to the distinct question, what makes for a good explanation of anything, or a correct moral theory of anything, I agree with Jeff that the merely possible do indeed matter, as he puts it, for their own sake. Jeff takes a second point from the Glover case as well, that a good explanation, a correct theory, will recognize that the claim that the merely possible matter for their own sakes is not narrowly confined to any special sort of world, for example, to those worlds where they happen to exist, or to the actual world. A failure of existential status at a given world doesn't mean a failure of moral status at that world. And a person can exist only at some alternate possible world, but what happens to that person there can still have implications for how we evaluate this world and how we evaluate the choices that are made in this world. So here too, I am in complete agreement with Jeff. We both reject moral actualism. And third and last, Jeff maintains that the good explanation, the correct theory, will have it that, in some sense or another, a happy person's never existing at all strips that person of a benefit. I'm happy to say that it imposes on that person a loss. The person who could have been well off in one world and doesn't exist at all in another world, seems to me we can say that that second world is worse for that person, that the person sustains a loss. But that's not important for purposes here. The important thing is that it matters to that happy person whether that happy person exists or not. That happy person, existing or not, has an interest, we could say, in existing. So as to this third point too, I'm totally in agreement with Jeff. I'm happy to say Jeff is not, that the future in which the person never exists is worse for the person than the future in which that person does or will exist and is happy, but again, that's not material here. So these 3 points are listed on the handout, maybe with a little bit more detail and a handful of other uncontroversial moral or conceptual principles. These work as Jeff's explanation or justification of, or his theory of, the extinction intuition. But I think there's a difficulty, a problem. To get all the way to the extinction intuition, we do need a fourth point. We need to say that all instances in which a person is deprived of a benefit, all losses, all instances in which things are made worse for a person rather than better, have roughly the same moral significance. That is, that they count against the world where they're sustained, and then depending on how we connect up, how we're ranking the worlds in terms of their betterness, and how we're evaluating conduct, which I want to keep that connection as close as I can, we'll also say that all of these acts, all of these instances, not just count against the world where they're sustained, but also, at least in principle, can make the choices that lead to that particular world or that particular future equally permissible. In other words, or that they don't count as equally permissible. In other words, let me put it like this. We might want to say with Jeff that all people, merely possible or not, matter morally at all practically possible outcomes or worlds. But we might also want to say that it's not the case that all their losses matter morally. I might matter morally, and just as much as anybody else does. That third child of mine might matter morally just as much as anybody else does, independent of whether we exist or not. It doesn't follow that all my losses matter morally as well. So consistent with 1 through 3, we might, in other words, accept what I'm here calling the loss distinction thesis, which is put a little bit more concretely in the form of the existence condition. So what the loss distinction thesis says is that the loss or benefit deprivation a person, P, sustains at a world X compared against a world Y is morally significant, that is, it counts against X, only if P does or will exist in X. So by implications, the losses we sustain by virtue of the fact that we never exist at all don't count against the worlds where we in fact never exist at all. So if the loss distinction thesis is at least credible, if it's a contender, then Jeff's explanation of the extinction intuition isn't complete. So the question is the loss distinction thesis at least credible? Or is it just arbitrary, ad hoc, something there to provide ourselves with a way of explaining in the create or assist case that we talked about earlier, why the right thing to do, why it makes the world better to extend Bella's life by 20 years rather than create the new person, Charlie, who will live for 30 years. Is it just an ad hoc way to explain that kind of intuition? I don't think that we can say it's arbitrary or ad hoc. There seems to be a plausibly morally relevant distinction between the sorts of losses, including deprivations of benefits, people avoidably sustain by virtue of the fact that they exist and suffer at a given world. We can call those ordinary losses, and the losses they avoidably sustain at worlds by virtue of the fact that they never exist at all at those worlds. We can call those existential losses. Putting the point more generally, and yes, it is intuitively, but I'm not trying to install intuitions. We don't have to have children, but if we do have them, we should make things better for them rather than worse. Your parents and mine were obligated to choose in ways that make things better for us rather than worse, other things equal, but they were never obligated to bring us into existence to begin with. To sum up, until we can rule out the loss distinction thesis, we can't get point 4. And until we can get point 4, we can't fully explain the extinction intuition. Now, I would think that Jeff would disagree. I think he thinks that he, in effect, has already secured point 4, and that he secures that point by way of discrediting, basically, he's aiming to destroy, to a large extent, the happy child half of the asymmetry, the very procreative asymmetry that he himself famously articulated a while back and has returned to periodically ever since. According to the happy child half of the asymmetry, other things equal, it doesn't make things worse and isn't wrong not to bring the happy child into existence. Now, I agree that if the happy child half of the asymmetry must go, so must the loss distinction thesis, and with it, the existence condition. So the pivotal question is, must we reject the happy child half of the asymmetry? Must that half of the asymmetry go? Must we reject it? So in this paper, I actually do look at 2 of Jeff's most interesting strategies for discrediting the happy child half of the asymmetry, and I think because of the time, I'll only have a chance to talk about the first of those 2 strategies. The first makes use of the uncontroversial miserable child half of the asymmetry, according to which, other things equal, it makes things worse and is wrong to bring the miserable child into existence. And the argument that I'm focusing on here is his parity of reasoning argument. What we want to say about the miserable child is, according to this argument, what we should now say about the happy child. What we want to say about the miserable child, we should now say what Jeff wants us to say about the happy child. After all, back to the 3 points, both children matter for their own sakes, whether they exist in any special world or not. And for both children, their coming into existence or not is a big deal. Okay. What we should do, I think, what we should say is that the parity of reasoning here between the 2 cases is extensive. but it doesn't mean it's complete. The lost distinction thesis, which we haven't yet ruled out without begging the question at hand, shows us where the parity fails. But that thesis has us analyze the two halves of the asymmetry in two very different ways. Regarding the miserable child half, we'll say this: consistent with the lost distinction thesis, the miserable child's loss at a world where that child exists and is miserable has full moral significance. It counts against that particular world, other things equal. It makes that the world where the child exists and suffers worse than the world where the child never exists. But regarding the happy child half of the asymmetry, we'll say this: because the happy child never exists at the world where that child isn't benefit, that is, where that child sustains a loss, that benefit deprivation, that loss doesn't count against that world. Other things equal, it leaves the world where the child never exists no worse than the world where the child does or will exist. So we talked in the prior discussion session, somebody, I think Tim, made the point that consequentialists do have moves that they can make. They can wait, for example, to go back to the creator assist case. They can come up with an explanation why it's better to extend Bella's life for 20 years rather than create the new person, Charlie, who will live for 30 years. The suggestion was weight Bella's year from a moral point of view more heavily than we weight Charlie's. But what I'm trying to do is also come up with a consequentialist way to explain the idea that what makes things better and what we ought to do is extend Bella's life for 20 years. What we don't have to do is create the new person, Charlie, and that doesn't make things better. So it's a consequentialist way of explaining that without going to the complications of trying to figure out exactly how the weighting of these different years, which look to be very similar, how that's going to work. Okay, so it seems to me, for those reasons, a parity of reasoning strategy doesn't discredit the happy child half of the asymmetry in the least. So we've got the 3 points, a lot of parity of reasoning there, but he needs the 4th point to get to the explanation. To get the 4th point, we have to rule out the lost distinction thesis and the existence condition, and we haven't been able to do that. So I am going to be stopping pretty quickly. Is that right, Tom? About 5 minutes? Okay. So I'm not going to have time to talk in any great detail about the second of Jeff's strategies for discrediting the happy child half of the asymmetry. I'll just briefly note it. I'm just not going to have time to talk about it, but it's a brilliantly provocative strategy that Jeff has for discrediting the happy child half of the asymmetry. And it's based on his populate the distant planet case. So it's actually on it's part 3 of the handout. Here is a case where basically what's happening is we have the choice whether to populate the distant planet or not. If we populate the distant planet, a lot of people, many additional people will exist and they'll all be happy. But inevitably, or at least he says statistically certain, that many people, though a much smaller number of people, will have lives less than worth living. I think he thinks, and I am drawn to this view too, that we have this intuition, that this intuition is pretty recalcitrant, that it's permissible to choose to populate the distant planet. Jeff thinks that we need to see the happiness of the happy people. We need to accept the happy child half of the asymmetry. We need the happiness of the happy people in the populate the distant planet case to balance out the misery of the relative few, which is to reject the happy child half of the asymmetry. It's to view the happiness of the happy people as counting in favor of that world. I'm tempted to think that it is permissible to populate the distant planet, to push that button and have that happen. Or if you've seen the movie Interstellar, we could think along those lines too. But what I see as creating the permissibility in this case are the probabilities that are at play here. What things look like from the perspective of each possible future person, including the miserable people. If we don't like standard expected value theory, maybe we can just call that thing probability-related anticipatory value for each such person when it's maximized. When it's maximized for each such person, as it would be in this case, it seems to me the choice is permissible, which is not to rule out the existence condition or the loss distinction thesis. Those are just the existence condition, the loss distinction thesis. It's just a sufficient condition on permissibility. There can be other sufficient conditions too, and I think this maximization of probability-related anticipatory value would create another sufficient condition for the permissibility of the choice to populate the distant planet. So that gets us to permissibility, but it's not actually enough to get us to the conclusion that I think that Jeff is going for, that human survival, to put the case in terms of human extinction versus human survival, that human survival is not merely permissible, that it's required, that it's obligatory. In the populate the distant planet case, it seems to me we can find a way to say that choice is permissible, but he wants to say that it's required, that it's obligatory. His extinction intuition is very strong. It's the worst of all possible, practically possible outcomes. As to that intuition, our explanation, I think, is not quite there yet. And I think I should stop here. Thank you.
And so for comments, we're going to hear from Tim Campbell.
It's an honor to be here, and Jeff, I want to say that it's been a pleasure to have you as my mentor and friend, and congratulations. And it's a privilege to be here with all of you. I do have some funny Jeff stories, but I think I'll save them for a coffee break. So in my comments, I want to start by saying a little bit more about Jeff's paper, Human Extinction and the Morality of Procreation. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this paper at all. Just to provide a little bit of context. And then I want to discuss Melinda's attempt to sort of push back on the parity, what she calls the parity of reasoning argument against the asymmetry. And I'll talk a little bit about the populate the planet case too. At the end, you didn't have time to do that. And I'm going to be on Jeff's side in this debate, so I'm going to be mostly critical. So in this paper, Human Extinction and the Morality of Procreation, Jeff asks how the extinction, what Melinda calls the extinction intuition, premature extinction would be the worst of all practically possible events, can be explained. So Jeff doesn't attempt to provide a fully general explanation of that intuition. So he leaves open that there can be different parts to the explanation of why extinction is bad. It may be that if humanity goes extinct prematurely, then those of us who are alive now will have lost something important, will be worse off in a sense. Our lives will have lost some meaning. It may be that there's some kind of impersonal value in collectives and certain forms of life. Culture, art, and so forth. But Jeff does think that the loss of many future good lives that extinction would cause, the fact that if extinction were to occur, there would be many fewer people such that if they were to exist, their existence would be good for them, is a crucial part of the explanation, the extinction intuition. And he also wants to say that we can have moral reason to prevent extinction, and therefore that we can have moral reason to bring about an outcome in which many people exist with good lives. All right. And Jonathan Glover's fertility pill case is central to that part of Jeff's argument. This leaves him, I'm going to come to it later. So yeah, went extinct. That's good, but not without moral reason. But this leads Jeff to reject the procreation asymmetry, right? The claim that while there is moral reason not to create a person with a bad life, there is no moral reason to create a person just because that person would have a good life. And it's specifically that second claim, what Jeff calls the negative claim, or Melinda calls the happy child half, that Jeff wants to reject. Right? And Jeff gives 4 arguments, as Melinda said, against that negative claim. There's what Jeff calls the parity argument, or Melinda calls the parity of reasoning argument. So we create a miserable person. Like, we have, why is that bad? Intuitively, the explanation is because it's bad for that person, and the fact that it's bad for that person gives us a moral reason not to create the person. Then it seems by parity of reasoning, we should accept that if we were to create a person with a good life, or a person with a happy life, that would be good for that person, and that similarly gives us a moral reason to create that person. Second argument is that Jeff thinks that the asymmetry leads to a kind of antinatalism that he finds implausible, and he thinks the part of the asymmetry that has to go is the happy child half, the negative claim. So the idea there is that, if there's a moral reason not to create a person with a bad life, but there's no moral reason to create a person just because they'd have a good life, then in any case where we create a new person, there's a chance that they could have a bad life, right? Even if it's very likely that they would have a good life, there's a chance that they could have a bad life. And Jeff thinks that if the asymmetry is right, then that chance, the mere fact that there's some probability that the person would have a bad life, provides a decisive reason not to have the child. And he thinks that that's implausible. What needs to go there is the claim that there's no moral reason to create a person just because they would have a good life. The third argument is that if we accept the asymmetry, then we have a hard time explaining intuitions about certain non-identity cases, right? So like a case where we could either create a person with an extremely good life or a different person with a life that's good but less good, right? Intuitively, you might think, well, we have moral reason to create the better life for one person rather than the merely good life for a different person. But if we think that there's no moral reason to create a person because they would have a good life, then it's hard to explain that. And then finally, there's the populate the planet argument, that the last argument that Melinda talked about, that it seems that if we accept the asymmetry, then there are certain cases where, science fiction cases where we could go populate a planet. There would be many good lives if we were to do that, but a tiny subset of those lives would be bad, right? If we have moral reason not to create those bad lives, but no moral reason to create the happy lives, then it seems like, all things considered, we have decisive reason not to populate the planet. That seems counterintuitive. So Melinda talks about the first and fourth of those arguments, and so that's what I'm gonna comment on. So let's start with the parity argument. Right? Melinda addresses the parity argument against the happy child half of the asymmetry by appealing to this loss distinction thesis, and this is where my two things can come in here. So the loss distinction thesis is on the handout. This is an abbreviated version of it. So I think we can explain the asymmetry and respond to the parity argument by appealing to this loss distinction thesis. Right? She assumes that merely possible people have moral status and that they can incur losses in worlds in which they don't exist. But she thinks that the loss a person P sustains at a future X compared against a future Y is morally significant, counts against X relative to Y, only if P does or will exist in X. And Melinda thinks that the loss distinction thesis can help explain the asymmetry, and in particular, can explain both halves, but also why accepting the miserable child half doesn't commit you to rejecting the happy child half. So in the case where I create the miserable person, then there exists a person, right, who Melinda would say sustains a loss. They're worse off than they would otherwise be. But in the case where I don't create a happy person, that merely possible person sustains a loss, but they don't exist, right? And so the loss is not morally significant. Now, I think that the parity argument holds up here. And I'm going to explain why. So some attempts to explain the asymmetry are, there are many attempts to try to explain the procreation asymmetry. And they encounter various problems. Some attempts to explain the asymmetry are problematic because the explanation they offer appeals to or presupposes or somehow involves a further asymmetry that is itself unexplained and puzzling. And I think this is true of Melinda's attempt to explain the asymmetry by appealing to the loss distinction thesis. But I don't think that that's obvious. I'm going to try to establish it. In fact, it seems to me that her attempt to explain the asymmetry involves a commitment to a kind of asymmetry, a further asymmetry that's in some sense more puzzling than the procreation asymmetry itself. It's not to say that this is true of all attempts to explain the asymmetry. So to see this, recall that Melinda assumes, it's on her handout, that even merely possible people have moral status and that they can incur losses in worlds in which they don't exist. She also, I think, attributes this claim to, or she thinks that Jeff thinks this. I'm not sure about that. But but she thinks that, so let's suppose that. But she suggests its personal losses have moral significance only if the people who incur them exist. Now, it seems to me that if merely possible people can incur losses in worlds in which they don't exist, then merely possible people can also gain. That is, they can benefit comparatively in worlds in which they don't exist. I see no reason why we should deny that if we think that merely possible people can incur losses. So an example of this would be the miserable child case, right? So I could create a miserable child or create no one, right? Now suppose I'm in this case and I don't create the miserable child, I create no one, right? Then in that case, it seems if we say along with Melinda that merely possible people can incur losses in worlds in which they don't exist, we should say in this case where I don't create the miserable person, that there's some merely possible person that benefits, that avoids a loss, a world in which they don't exist. Now I take it, I hope Melinda wants to say, maybe we can imagine a more dramatic version of this case. Someone else is going to create the miserable child by pushing a button, and suppose I intervene and stop them, right? So, now I take it Melinda wants to say that when I prevent the existence of the miserable child, I brought about a better outcome. The fact that one less miserable child exists counts in favor of the outcome that I brought about, at least relative to the alternative in which that miserable child exists. And I think she would also agree, she could tell me whether I'm wrong, that if other things are equal in this case, I've done what was morally required of me. That means that the benefit, the avoidance of the loss to some non-existent person has moral significance. It counts in favor of the outcome in which the person doesn't exist. So I take it Melinda rejects the second thesis on the slide, the benefit distinction thesis. This says that the benefit that a person P has at a future X compared against a future Y is morally significant, counts in favor of X relative to Y, only if P does or will exist in X. She rejects that, I take it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to say about the miserable child case, where I prevent the existence of the miserable child, that the benefit of that non-existent person counts in favor of the outcome where they don't exist. So she accepts, I take it, the loss distinction thesis, but she rejects the benefit distinction thesis. And I find that puzzling. In my opinion, affirming the loss distinction thesis while rejecting the benefit distinction thesis is something that calls for further explanation. Why is it that benefits matter morally when the beneficiary, a person whom we're assuming along with Melinda now, has moral status, doesn't exist? But losses don't matter morally when the person with moral status who incurs them doesn't exist. So to sort of wrap this part up, I find it kind of hard to accept that merely possible people do have moral status. I find it difficult to accept that they can incur losses and gains in worlds in which they never exist. But I also find it puzzling that if we accept those two claims, then while the losses of the non-existent have no moral significance, the gains of the non-existent do. So is the loss distinction thesis ad hoc? Maybe not by itself, but I think when combined with the negation of the benefit distinction thesis, it is. I think what we have here is an attempt to explain the asymmetry that just pushes the puzzle around. It appeals to a further asymmetry. And I think at the end of the day, so what we've said so far, Jeff's parity argument holds up. How much? That's pretty much it? All right, so I guess I won't be able to talk about the populate the planet case. But now, I've said enough. Maybe we can talk about it in Q&A. Thanks.
Okay, so put your hands up high and hold them there until I've acknowledged you, please. We'll kick off with Andrew.
Apologies to Jeff if he answers this question in his paper. I look forward to reading it. I'm interested in the contrast between the way that both of you have addressed this problem with the way that some other philosophers think about it. It looks to me that, so I'm interested in how you'd extend your view to look at a factor they think is important. What made me think of this was Rawls's remark that sometimes we may be tempted to agree with Kant that it would be better that human beings had never existed if it wasn't even possible for them to live together in a just society. And so there's a question about whether facts about moral progress or moral regress make a difference to our attitude to the non-continuation of the human race. And I'm interested in how much of a difference they make. So imagine somebody tells me the human race can exist in the way that photocopied bits of paper can exist. We've got a photocopier that just produces lots of copies of an existing, decent, or happy life. They're just identical. There's nothing new. And then we think to ourselves, when we look back at human history, lots of human beings, even if they had lives worth living, treated each other extraordinarily wrongly. Right? It's a moral horror, the past. And then we think, recently there's been a bit of progress, but there's a risk. There's going to be really serious moral decline, but that's consistent with individuals all having lives worth living, but they're still leading really bad lives. And then I think some people think to themselves, that makes a difference what our attitude to the continuation of humanity should be. Maybe it would just be better, as Rawls and Kant entertain, that this horror show ended, even if we have the photocopier continuing to produce decent lives. I don't have the impulse that makes me care about the photocopier very much. Even if it generates some reasons, those reasons are not very strong. But I have a great aversion to evil. So I want to know to what extent you think that should enter into our attitude, non-existence. The point can be generalized. There are lots of values which are not person-involving, natural values, nature, for example. The human race, if it comes to extinction, that will be in some respects regrettable, but nature will flourish. We saw that in the pandemic. No, I'm just asking you, here's another factor. I'm just saying, why aren't you mentioning these factors?
I have a little
You're right,
something.
sorry.
Can I respond? I think I have a mic here, so is that okay for me to say something? So this, what you're suggesting, I mean, I'm not going to talk, I couldn't agree with you more about much of what you've said, but the view that I want to favor, or that I favor, so just to simplify your example a little bit, we've got lives worth living in the future, but you said maybe they'll be really bad lives because of all of the injustice and the torture and the bad things that happen to non-human animals. So maybe non-existence is better in a way. There's that argument. And so that would be a kind of anti-natalist argument. My view would not go there. But what it would say is, so this actually takes us back to John Broom's argument and his argument against an unrestricted neutrality. If we have a world where a given person never exists at all, so you can imagine one future person, a bazillion future people, another world where that person exists and is well off, has a pretty good life, a positive well-being level, and then a third world where that same person has a much better life. So he uses that case to argue against unrestricted neutrality. And what I think his argument actually shows us, if we do want to retain some version of neutrality, what I think his argument shows us is that going forward, our permissible strategies are not to bring that person into existence, or to bring that person into existence and maximize well-being for that person. But the world that would be worse and the choice that would be wrong would be to bring that person into existence and make things worse for that person rather than better. So going forward, in terms of human extinction versus human survival, human survival is great, it's permissible. Maybe it's obligatory given all of the benefits that it has for existing and otherwise future people. But other things equal, it's just permissible. But if we do continue, then we should do the best we can for each person who does or will exist, so that anything that counts as a loss for them is going to count against the world where we bring about human survival, but do a crappy job of it. Don't try to secure things for people for the future to help them avoid these losses, all of which would count as morally significant. Does that answer your question? Oh, sorry. No, it doesn't. Okay.
Thanks. So I want to push back against what seems to be a widely shared view that the infertility case establishes that future people coming into existence is good for them, right? So first of all, as Tim, you mentioned, there are all sorts of reasons why. So the intuition is our being infertile is a really horrible, our becoming infertile, all of us, would be a really horrible thing. So obviously a lot of that has to do with how bad it is for us, also that perhaps our culture doesn't continue. But now, so change the example so that there are non-overlapping generations like silkworm, and also let's suppose that there's no causal continuity of culture. I think the intuition of the badness becomes much less great. We might still think it's bad, okay? But I think one reason why we think there's something especially bad about extinction is that then there just won't be any, I mean, assuming we're the only sentient, rational beings in the universe, there just won't be any sentient, rational beings in the universe anymore. It'll be devoid. And that makes it worse that there not be beings in the future than that there not be more and more beings in the present, sort of temporal versus geographic. But that difference really has nothing to do with what's good or bad for them. So I don't think the view that infertility and therefore extinction is so bad actually at all establishes that it's good for future people to come into existence for their sake.
I want to echo Mike's remark. I felt the exact same way. I don't think that the best explanation for extinction being bad is because it's bad for the particular people who never exist, who would have existed. And I think part of what we think about here is we have to remember what's Francis nicely called the principle of contextual interaction. You look at principles that seem very plausible in certain cases, then you want to generalize those as the explanation for other cases. But I think they're good for some cases and they're not good for others. So if you think about the case where you could extend someone's life for 20 years, or a new person comes into existence for, say, 30 years, and let's not think of a single person, let's think of thousands and thousands of people in that case. Now imagine first case, lots and lots of people already exist. Now I think the narrow person affecting view sounds quite plausible. Let's extend by 20 rather than 30. But now imagine that the alternative is we extend some people who exist now for 20 years in a world where there's lots and lots and lots of people. Or we have other people come into existence later where no one else would exist for 30 years. Now in that case, I think the second one is much better, and the narrow person affecting principle is not going to account for that. In fact, I think if we have the choice of extending lots of people who are alive today for 30 years in a world where lots and lots of people exist, or future period where no one exists except for all these people who would come into existence for 20 years, I think the world with 20 years in existence is better. Because I think it's very important that different times be filled with high-quality sentient life. I think it's much less important that different spaces be filled with high-quality life. And yet, the very same people might be involved in those two cases, which makes me think it's not a narrow person affecting type consideration. Thank you. It's so closely related to Mike's question that I thought we should put them together.
Those are very hard questions, and Tim may have much to say about those as well, which is a plea for help. So I am trying to be a maximizing consequentialist, but a certain kind of maximizing consequentialist. I'm not going to talk about the person affecting intuition because there's so many different ways of formulating that, and most of them, I think we can agree, just don't work out very well. This idea that there's an impersonal value to having humans go on, the human species go on and on, independent of how that affects anyone who exists now or anyone who will otherwise exist going forward, any existing or future person. To my ears, I guess one thing I'm trying to do is avoid pluralism that incorporates both how things affect existing and future people at every possible world that's practically available to us, as Jeff says. A form of pluralism that recognizes all of that, and that also recognizes value that's very closely related to that, but that's impersonal in nature. I'm trying to go for a theory that doesn't require us to say that this kind of value has this much weight and this other kind of value has this other weight, and this is how they're going to balance out against each other. Because people who are pluralists tend not to do that. They don't say they can do that. They don't pretend to do it. And it's very hard then to come up with a testable theory. So my worry when I start thinking about the value of having the human species continue 1 billion years from now, if that does make things better, if that's the better world, then at what cost does that come to existing and future people, to existing and otherwise future people? I'm trying to avoid results like the repugnant conclusion, results that would have existing or future people sacrifice inordinately, in my view, inordinately existing and future people, not just existing people, but future people too, sacrifice inordinately to make sure that there is a human species out there 1 billion years from now. So that's the kind of strategy that I have, and that's almost all I can say in response. Except to say, I don't have that. I mean, we're talking a lot about intuition, especially in our prior talk. Victor was talking about his intuitions and so on and so forth. I think my intuitions are a little bit narrower, I guess, or more, it's just a few. They're just a few. But the intuition that it makes things morally, that the world is morally better if in 1 billion years the human species still exists, I don't have that intuition. Other things equal.
Yeah. So I'll just comment briefly on it. So on both Mike's and Larry's comments, we're getting into population ethics a bit now, and so things are getting tricky. Mike, on your point, there can be other explanations of why extinction is bad. We don't, apart from saying that it's bad if there are fewer people such that if they were to exist, their existence would be good for them. I think, so when Jeff brings up the fertility pill case, that's supposed to be a case where we just stipulate that everyone who takes the pill is better off, right? So that part of the explanation, so everyone takes the pill and they're better off, but no more people ever exist. So that's supposed to be a case where that, our lives would be worse if there were no future people. That's not supposed to be present in that case. And you're right, there are lots of other things you could say. Larry's point was that, how much it matters whether we add future people might depend on how many people happy people there already are, and it might depend where we add them, whether we add them, at the end of a time period so that there's always at least some people existing, or whether we add them in space at a single time, right? Let me just say one thing. I think one reason why Jeff thinks, and I'm speaking for Jeff now, and he can speak for himself later, why an important part of the explanation of why extinction is bad is that there would be fewer people for whom existence would be good if they existed, is that we can imagine cases where if humanity continues to exist, there will be many good lives, but there will also be some bad lives, right? Some people with utterly miserable lives. And if humanity continues longer and longer, the more miserable lives we'll have, right? Now, I think Jeff finds it difficult to explain why it would be permissible to extend humanity in those cases. And maybe you don't think it's permissible, but assuming that it is, it's hard to explain that. How can we justify it to those people with all those miserable lives just by pointing to, the impersonal value of collectives and on Larry, on your point about lives mattering less the more they are, I mean, depends on the shape of your view, right? But if, in that scenario that I described, at some point, you're not going to get much value from adding the good lives, but hopefully you don't think that the bad lives have diminishing marginal value, right? That's going to get worse and worse and worse, and so at some point, I guess, on your view, the kind of view you're describing, it's going to be impermissible to extend humanity, but intuitively it is. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say on Jeff's behalf. He's giving me the thumbs up, so.
But actually, that's not part of my view.
Yes, thank you. That's a really interesting. I think I'm unsure about my own intuitions. I'm trying to tease out to what extent my intuitions pick up on the sort of welfare-related reasons versus just purely the existence of people. And I guess something that I was wondering, thinking about losses and benefits, was what we should think about cases of bringing people into existence that will have a neutral welfare level. So would that be a sort of good scenario? Would that be, a scenario that we should be undecided about on these views? Yeah, that's the question.
I didn't catch one word. Bringing people into existence who have what?
A neutral welfare level.
Have what? Neutral. Oh, okay. So I would assume that a neutral well-being, I would say if it's a neutral well-being level, to make sense of that to me, they're zero benefits, zero burdens. That would be an instance of a neutral existence, or where the burdens and the benefits exactly outweigh each other, or exactly counterbalance each other. That too would sum up to a zero well-being level. In a case where that kind of additional existence is neither good nor bad for anybody else who does or will exist, when we have the option of leaving everything alone and simply not bringing that person into existence at all, it's a horrible scenario to contemplate, but I'm not seeing that it would make things morally better or worse to bring that additional person at that zero level into existence. I mean, in any kind of realistic case, if you bring somebody into existence anticipating, because of the burdens and benefits exactly balancing each other, if you're anticipating a zero well-being level on a net basis, you're putting that person at grave risk, that the well-being level will sink below a zero level in any kind of real-world case. But in the hypothetical case, I think I would be committed to saying it doesn't make things better, it doesn't make things worse in that case. The probabilities come into play here, because that would be the kind of case where in advance, the information available to agents might not be telling them that that well-being level is going to be zero. So from a probability-related, anticipatory perspective for that person, it might look like the well-being level will be, clearly within the positive range. And in that case, I do think it's permissible to make the choice to bring the person into existence. It could be permissible, even if things don't turn out well. The choice could be permissible, even if the outcome doesn't turn out as expected. Okay.
Make things concise. Do you want to say
I think it's permissible to have the neutral life, but I don't think there's a positive reason to add it or a positive reason not to add it.
So, the blue shirt up the back. That's it.
So I also wanted to ask about these non-well-being values. So I wonder kind of if there's a point that the welfarist can make here as well, right? So one way of being a welfarist is to just not feel the intuitions that there are these impersonal values and to just think, I just can't see why anyone would care about those. But I think another way of being a welfarist is to think, yeah, I can really feel the pull that those values seem intuitive. I just can't bring myself to think that something can be good without being good for anyone. And I just don't think that we're going to have any good way of kind of explaining what those intuitions amount to or how they could be genuine values. And I wonder if this could be kind of a point in favor of your view, Melinda, where you kind of say, look, one reason why we might feel the extinction intuition really strongly is it's very natural to feel these intuitions about things being important impersonally, even though they're not good for anyone. It just turns out that on reflection, we can't justify that, right? We can't actually say that something turns out to be valuable without somehow tying it to someone's value. So I'd be interested to hear what you both think about that kind of line of argument.
Just briefly, so certainly I think taking the infertility pill, in that case, the population taking the infertility pill, making each person better off who does in fact now exist, but creating no future generations, that's a horrible perspective to me. And I very much care that people not take the infertility pill. But as much as anything, I'm trying to feel other people's deeply held intuitions about these things. And so to me, Jeff's intuition about human extinction hits home most clearly when I'm thinking about those possible people I grant full moral status to never existing at all. So that's why I'm focused on that. But it could be that you're right, we do seem to have too many intuitions about these cases. And maybe some of them need to be called out.
Do you want to talk about it over lunch or at a coffee break? I was asking how many people are in the queue.
Okay, great, thanks. There's a mic coming down, but you can just... Yep, go ahead.
I mean, my reaction was like Larry's, but I've now was preempted twice. But I think I will respond a little bit to Melinda's comments in response. I don't think it's right to say that there's a conflict, there's a sort of a pluralism of well-being values and impersonal values. The view that Larry was proposing is just a view about how you aggregate the values in individual lives, which if you want, you can say is how good those lives are for the people who live them. So the idea is that at a time, the overall value in the universe, and by the way, that's not a well-being value. It's not as if the total happiness of everybody is good for any individual. That is what is simply good. And the idea is that the value in the world at a time is not the sum of the individual values in the individual lives. The value of an additional life gets less the more lives there are. That's not two values. It's just a way of combining the values in individual lives into a total value in the universe at a time. And I just will say, it's got to be diminishing marginal value at a time. And then you might add those values through time. You might think that it's always better to add another generation of human beings living lives, with culture and science and justice, if you care about that sort of thing. Anyways, you could also have diminishing marginal value through time. So if the human race has existed for 75 millennia, it doesn't matter so much that it exists for a couple more. But anyways, that's the main suggestion, is just that I think what Larry and others have in mind is not personal values and impersonal values. It's a way of combining personal values to arrive at the overall impersonal value of a state of the universe at a time. Maybe that's a suggestion. Sorry if that's not a question.
Don't you see?
And so, thank you. So that way of combining these, instead of calling them person-based versus impersonal values, they're all basically person-based in a way. But isn't that in virtue of the fact that these possible future people will exist and be happy? Isn't that what makes those person-based? So, right. So we're adding their gains in to figure out the overall value. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, but the more other people there are, the less my gain matters.
There may be diminishing marginal utilities to additional people. That's hard for me. If my having the third child made things better, it's hard for me, other things equal, to see why the fourth child doesn't make things better still and the fifth child doesn't make things better still. It's hard for me to see the diminishing marginal utility. And then as to the benefits to those future people, the loss distinction thesis, it does imply a benefit distinction thesis. It's just not that one. This one would be one that we need to reach at.
I agree that it's about your point about it not being about personal value versus impersonal value.
I'd like to make a suggestion that actually may not be that helpful a suggestion, which accounts for Tim's comments and what Melinda's presenting. So you seem to think that you're not very worried about extinction, but you might also, we wouldn't think it would be bad perhaps if we do settle some new planet. It's a no cost. So here's kind of another way of trying to resolve this. So taking into account Tim's kind of consideration about the parity, you might say, well, look, actually we just do think these are equal in some way. But then you could appeal to something like a narrow person affecting view and a symmetrical narrow person affecting view and say, well, actually, there's just no value creating the unhappy person, there's no disvalue creating the unhappy person. And then if you then appeal to something in moral uncertainty, where you say, look, we we have credences over different sort of theories in population ethics. So we've got some credence in, say, a narrow person-affecting view, and then some credence in a totalist view, and then there's some further way of trying to resolve those. Then you might say, well, look, we're primarily concerned about the people here and now, but maybe there is some consideration to be given to future people. But if we've got most of our credence in the narrow person-affecting stuff, then we're not going to give it loads of credence to the future people. And so we're more worried about the people now, but perhaps if we can create people in the future at no cost, then we're gaining something and not losing anything. So I think that captures I think that captures some of the conclusion you want, although perhaps not by the mechanisms and assumptions that you would want.
I would love to talk to you more about how that would work. It seems to me that future people, just like other possible people, merely possible or not, that they matter exactly as much as existing people do. So the person who's not going to come into existence until a week from today matters exactly as much as you and I do. And the merely possible person who could have come into existence a week from today matters exactly as much as you and I do. It seems to me that we need to say that because of other work that Jeff has done and that Larry has done and that other people here have done. So what I would need to be educated on is why we should give any credence to a moral view we think is mistaken. So I know a lot of people think that. A lot of people think that existing people deserve more from us than people who won't exist until next week. I don't understand that view, and it seems to me a mistaken view. So that would be my question. How does the credence approach work for a theory that you think is false?
Yes, your time has come.
Yay.
Okay, one of the, I had a finger on the point that Mike and Larry were making, and then a brief point on Melinda's talk. I did agree with what Tim said in defense of the view that I have argued for. What Mike said was that what we tend to believe, and I think this is true, is that we think it matters that more people exist on into the future than that more people should exist at the present time just elsewhere in space. That's a common intuition. He said, but if that's right, then we can't explain the extinction intuition by reference to the benefits that people get by coming into existence or by our reason to benefit people by causing them to exist with good lives. And I would just say, I think that there's an explanation for this intuition, and that is that if people continue to exist over time, then there are going to be the forms of continuity between generations that Sam Scheffler says are important to all of us. And there's also going to be the kind of, or at least until recently, one might have believed, until Trump got elected, one might have believed that there would be progress in civilization, and that things would get better and better, and people's lives would get better and better. And this is possible when we think about extending lives indefinitely over time, but doesn't happen if lives are extended indefinitely across space. So what I think is that, if we had a choice between a lot of lives now and then followed by a gap in time where there'd be no people existing for 20,000 years, and then another civilization comes into existence, lasts for a certain amount of time, but is totally unconnected with the one before. So that extension over time does not involve continuity and progress and looks exactly like extension over space, then I lose this intuition that extension over time matters more than extension over space. Okay, Melinda, you see me looking a little sad at the moment. And that is because I don't really quite understand this notion of what you call probability-related anticipated value for the people whose lives will be worth living on the planet that we could populate, a distant planet that we could populate with people. It seems to me that if the probability of these people having these good lives has the effect of offsetting the acknowledged reason that we have not to create the inevitable lives that are not worth living. Something has got, for it to be permissible for us to populate this planet, something has got to morally offset the existence of the people we're going to cause to exist with lives that are not worth living. And if what's doing that is what you call the probability-related anticipated value of the good lives, then those lives are offsetting the badness of the bad lives. What nobody in here knows except you and Tim, because the paper that you read hasn't been published, is that quite a big chunk of that paper is devoted to giving arguments for rejecting the distinction that I appealed to in the past to try to salvage the asymmetry or the procreation asymmetry from these challenges, namely that what I call non-comparative benefits, that is, good things caused to exist by causing people to exist, can have what I called an offsetting function even if they don't have a reason-giving function. So there may be no reason to bring about these benefits by causing people to exist, but if we do bring about those benefits by causing people to exist, that can offset the bad effects of causing the people to exist. That's how I used to think that one could prevent the asymmetry from implying antinatalism. But I am not going to give those arguments now, but I no longer think that that strategy works. And so for your argument against the populated planet argument to go through, you've got to explain how it is that the good lives are somehow offsetting the bad lives, even though we don't have any reason whatsoever to cause those good lives to exist.
Now I should look sad and go back to my hotel room. Okay, so what I'll just say that is a really important point. I do talk about this in the paper that I did write, but didn't have time to go into this. So I'm not a fan of standard expected value theory. I think a lot of people have criticisms of how that works, but we all think that probabilities are nonetheless important in evaluating choices. But so I'm calling that probability-related anticipatory value. Whatever it is, I don't have a theory yet. But I don't think it offsets the bad lives that in fact come about at the world where we do choose to populate the distant planet. So I think the anticipated value can explain why the choice to go forward with populating the planet is permissible. Not that it's obligatory, but that it's permissible. Just like the choice not to populate the planet would also be permissible. But I don't think, when we're talking about probabilities, I don't think that that's going to do any offsetting work when it comes to figuring out which is the morally better outcome. So the fact that, so it just doesn't have that offsetting effect. That's not the role it plays. It makes the choice permissible, but it doesn't make the world better. The fact that I'm slightly more likely to survive a heart attack versus not survive a heart attack now, right in front of all of you, is not going to change the value of the outcome that then results. That Tim is unable to save my life, or there's a certain probability that he can save my life if he does one thing versus another thing. I don't think that's going to change the value of the outcome, but it may make one choice permissible and another choice impermissible.
Tom, could I just brief
30 seconds, yeah.
Brief response? Okay, 30 seconds. The example was meant to be one in which it's absolutely certain, beyond all question, that the vast majority of the lives on this planet will be well worth living. A very small proportion of them will be not worth living. We have a moral reason, according to the asymmetry, not to bring about the outcome in which there are lives that are not worth living. We have no moral reason whatsoever to bring about the outcome in which the lives would be worth living. I stipulated also that the creation of this population on this planet is not better for anybody else in the universe. And it looks, therefore, as if the balance of reasons is we have a reason not to populate this planet. My intuition is that it is permissible, though not obligatory, to populate this planet. But if the asymmetry is right, it's impermissible to populate the planet. Thanks.
So we will be back here in 1 hour, but before you go, please join me in thanking our speakers. Melinda.
Thank you.